Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Nessie and the Living Stone by Lois Wickstrom, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me. Chapter 1, The Magic Stone. Craig, Linda. It was Roy, the tan, college-age Loch Ness Coast Guard, bossing them again. Roy zoomed his patrol boat up beside them near the shore of Loch Ness. Craig, Linda, how many times do I have to tell you? Stay out of the water. I don't want to have to rescue you. Then he roared away again. Roy always seemed to be watching them, trying to ruin their fun. Up the hill behind them, Craig could see Mrs. Carmichael, the hostess at the bed and breakfast, hanging out sheets beside the shed. She, too, always seemed to be watching them. When school vacation started, Craig was happy to be away from bossy teachers, but now he was learning that wherever he went, all the grown-ups wanted to tell him what to do. Not just in Birmingham, where he lived in a tall apartment building, but here on the shore of Loch Ness, too. 2 whole weeks he had been here, and he hadn't even caught a glimpse of the Loch Ness Monster. And Mom had put him in charge of his bratty little sister, Linda. She tagged along behind him, picking purple flowers along the shore and sticking them in her braids. Sticking flowers in her hair was just plain stupid. And every time she saw a floating log or even a wave behind a motorboat, she yelled, "I see her! I see Nessie!" Craig was so tired of saying, "No, you don't. It's not her," that he walked along in silence, kicking the rounded pebbles along the shoreline with his bare toes. The warm summer sun beat down on his back, and Craig gazed out across the water. On the opposite shore of the long, narrow lake stood a glen of rounded trees. Wildfowl squawked as they dove for fish. Craig had high hopes when he and his parents left the brick buildings and crowded sidewalks of Birmingham. He was going to see Nessie. 2 more days. The day after tomorrow they would leave. His chance to find Nessie would be gone. Craig kicked some pebbles along the shore. Suddenly, the earth lurched beneath him. Books and drinks on stands beside the lounge chairs toppled. A large wave came up from Loch Ness, soaking him and Linda waist high. An earthquake, he thought. The wave receded, and Craig kicked another pebble. He heard a ping, then a chime. He looked down. Something the size of a shooter marble glowed blue. He bent down and picked it up. His fingers tingled against the smooth, warm, glass-like stone. Did this belong to someone? It looked like a smooth, old-fashioned jewel carved for a special setting. Other tourists further back on the shore hadn't been splashed at all. They were dashing about, calling to family or friends, making sure no one was hurt. No one seemed interested in Craig's find. The warm blue sphere pulsed in his hand. Blue fire flashed in its center. "What's that?" asked Linda. "Can I touch it?" He stuffed it into his pocket and pretended to ignore her. In the water, he saw another glow, green this time. Another wonderful stone? "This one's mine," shouted Linda. She jumped into the loch and splashed towards it. "I see her. I see Nessie." Craig started to yell, "No, you," but the stone in his pocket pulsed warmly against his leg, and he thought he saw the green glow more. He dashed into the lake to where Linda was standing and looked down into the deep, dark, cloudy water. A large head, like a swimming dinosaur with fiery green eyes, stared up at them from the murky water. Linda took his hand silently. He had never seen anything so big in his life. It had to be Nessie. The Coast Guard boat whirred in front of them. Roy raised his megaphone to his lips. "Get out of the water." Had Roy seen Nessie? Was he shooing them away so he could capture her? Roy didn't sound excited. He used the same bossy voice he always used. "Get out of the water now." Roy's boat came closer. The water was cloudy with sand raised by the earthquake. Nessie was too far down for Roy to see unless he came as close as her and Craig and as close to her as Craig and Linda. He was coming closer by the second. "Come on, Linda," shouted Craig. "Let's get out of the water." He didn't want Roy to come close enough to see Nessie. If they got out of the water, Roy would leave them alone. Linda kept walking toward Nessie's green glowing eye. Craig grabbed Linda's hand to pull her back. The dinosaur dove, creating a strong undertow that caught Craig unaware. He was pulled under and scared. Then the stone in his pocket pulsed and his fear disappeared. Linda still held his hand. Even though he had his Red Cross swimmer certificate, he couldn't swim with his sister holding one hand. He could just hear his mother saying, "You're 10, you're the big brother. Is this how you take care of your little sister? You get her drowned?" He tried to shake her off. They were still near enough the surface that she might make it if she started swimming up now. But instead of swimming for the surface, Linda clung to him with both hands as they were pulled deeper and deeper. They tumbled helplessly in Nessie's wake. It felt like forever before the monster finally came to a halt. When he found his balance, Craig looked into the face of a large green dinosaur with a long neck and huge flippers. It had long purple stripes on both sides, like racing stripes, and purple spots down its back as big as frisbees. He took a deep breath before he thought, I'm underwater. How can I breathe? He looked at Linda. Bubbles came out of her mouth. She was smiling. The dinosaur turned abruptly, flicked its tail, and dove even deeper. This time there was no undertow. Craig tried to follow the dinosaur. He swam with one arm, towing Linda with the other. He gave a firm kick, and the stone fell out of his pocket. He gasped for air, and his mouth filled with water. Linda dug her fingernails into his arm. Craig kicked the scissor kick he had learned in life-saving class and stroked hard with his one free arm. His lungs hurt. Linda was a dead weight. The surface of the water flickered far above them, and there in the water was Roy. He had a tank of air on his back. Roy dove down, grabbed Craig with one arm and Linda with the other. Then, with his flipper-clad feet, he kicked their way to the surface. Roy dragged them roughly to the shore and dumped them on the pebbles. A chill breeze revived Linda. I told you to stay out of the water, he growled at them. If I have to rescue you again, I'll send your parents a bill. As if on cue, there were his parents running down the hill from the B&B. His mom was waving her arms wildly. His dad was yelling at her. How could you trust that washerwoman to look after our children? Tears streaked Mom's face as she lifted Linda in her arms. Craig saw that his mom's tears were from being yelled at, not because she was worried about Linda. Linda was fine. She was already squirming to get out of Mom's arms and onto the shore. Mom shouted, Somebody get me a blanket quickly, my baby might go into shock. A tourist brought a beach towel. Mom grabbed it and wrapped Linda, gushing. Thanks, you're a doll. Then she turned to Craig. How could you let your sister go into the water? She nearly drowned. I tried to warn them, ma'am, said Roy. Yeah, right, said Craig. You knew there was going to be an earthquake. You apologize right now, said Craig's mom. That's no way to talk to a man who just saved your life. Craig looked at his dad, hoping for reason. Nobody knew there was going to be an earthquake. Craig's dad's cheeks turned red. You apologize when your mother tells you to. I apologize, said Craig to nobody in particular. I saw Nessie, said Linda. No, you didn't, said Roy. You disobeyed the Loch Ness Coast Guard and nearly drowned. We really saw Nessie, said Linda. No, you didn't, said Roy. You were too close to the water, and the earthquake toppled you in. Maybe now you'll understand why you shouldn't play along the shoreline. Go up to Mrs. Carmichael's and don't let me catch you on the shores of Loch Ness ever again. Mom put Linda down, wrapped in the tourist towel. Craig and Linda obediently walked up the slope to where Mrs. Carmichael was hanging up more laundry beside her shed. Roy climbed back into the Coast Guard boat and roared across the lake. Both of their parents followed closely behind them. Why do grown-ups think that good parents stick close to their children, wondered Craig. Children would never grow up if they were supervised all the time. You've got to get that pretty stone back, whispered Linda. It's at the bottom of the loch by now, Craig whispered back. You've got to go look for it. You've got to try, insisted Linda. How am I going to get away from all these grown-ups? Asked Craig. Mom and Dad have to entertain a client this afternoon, said Linda. You only have to deal with Mrs. Carmichael. What if Mrs. Carmichael tries to stop me? Asked Craig. I'll keep her busy, volunteered Linda. When you see her backside, run for it. Maybe you're not useless after all, said Craig, still rubbing his arm where her fingernails had left red dents. Once they were at the B&B, Craig's mom herded them to their guest room. Stay in your room and take a nap now. You must be tired from all that excitement. Craig didn't protest. If she thought he was in his room, she wouldn't be looking for him on the shore of Loch Ness. Funny how grown-ups never suspect anything when you act obedient. Linda pulled a wilted flower out of one braid. My braids are ruined, she whimpered. Take a nap now, honey. You know I'm no good at braids. You can ask Mrs. Carmichael when you wake up. Mom patted Linda's head, something she knew Linda hated. Linda whined, I want my braids fixed now. Dad stood in the doorway and said, Can't you get her to be quiet? I'll get Mrs. Carmichael, said Mom. Just do it quickly, said Dad. We have to meet my customer for afternoon tea. Dad glared at them while Mom went to get Mrs. Carmichael. Craig closed his eyes and pretended to be sleepy. When Mom returned, Dad said, Now go put on your dress and makeup. We're running late. Dad herded Mom down the hallway, and Mrs. Carmichael said, louder than necessary, So you're the little maiden who wants flowers in her hair. Linda bounced on her bed, causing it to squeak and making it difficult for Mrs. Carmichael to brush out her braids. You wouldn't be trying to distract me now, would you?" said Mrs. Carmichael, a slight grin forming at the corners of her mouth. Linda winked at Craig. Putting flowers in her hair might be stupid, but at least this time it served a purpose. "Now, Linda, face the back window so Mrs. Carmichael can brush your hair," said Craig. "But I like to keep watch for Nessie out the front window," said Mrs. Carmichael. "I wouldn't want to miss her, you know, especially since you two already saw her once today. She must be up and about." Craig groaned. Linda obediently turned to face the back window. "You don't have to obey your brother, you know," said Mrs. Carmichael. "Don't you want to look for Nessie?" "I want to look at your flowers," said Linda. She bounced on the bed a few more times to find the place with the loudest squeak. "Oh, well, my flower garden is lovely too," said Mrs. Carmichael. "We can decide which flowers you want for your hair while I brush out the tangles." Craig waited. He heard his mother's high-heeled shoes clack down the hall, accompanied by his father's heavy tread. Then the door of the B&B opened and closed. Finally, he watched his parents get into their rented car and drive away. "Are you going to help us pick out girly flowers?" asked Mrs. Carmichael, turning to face him. "I'll leave that to you girls," said Craig, picking up a book, pretending to read. "Look at those yellow daisies," said Linda, pointing. "You can have some of those," said Mrs. Carmichael, leaning toward the window. Craig saw his chance and sneaked to the door of their room, which Mrs. Carmichael had left open just enough for him to squeeze through. He heard her say, "And some violets, too," as he sneaked down the hall. "They're lovely, but they're nothing compared to the singing flowers that grow at the bottom of the loch. Sometime, sometimes my nets wash up with singing flowers caught in their ropes." Linda bounced on the squeaky bed again, making enough noise for him to open the door, step out, and close it again unnoticed. He dashed down the slope to the shore. The dinosaur was gone. The tourists were gone. Roy was on the other side of the loch, but where was his stone? Suddenly, the earth shook again, an aftershock. Another wave soaked him to the waist, and as it receded, there was his stone again, on the shore. He bent down, picked it up, and put it back into his pocket.